This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country, and we join their calls for justice.
Let's watch our favourite video.
Ooh.
Your day at MinRes starts now.
Why does she have...
Hey.
It's the bathrobe over the
To
suit.
MinRes HQ. This is a building like no other. It's been designed with your well-being in mind. And I'm
Okay,
here
pretty schmick.
to show you how to unlock all of its incredible benefits. Let's get started.
We are, of course, watching the cursed Julie Bishop MinRes video cam, which Cam Wilson, who's with us, introduced the world to on Twitter this week.
Hello. I can't believe I'm responsible for this, but yes, I did. I was the one who was out there promoting Julie Bishop. That's great. She's got something. She's got a bit of pizzazz, doesn't she?
Oh, she does. Yeah. I mean, and that apparently entitles her to just be like the absolute girl boss of Australian politics and industry. Apparently.
Putting the gas in gaslighting.
Should we watch? I mean, this is a video that is literally almost 7 minutes long. So there's no fucking way we're playing the whole thing on this podcast. Maybe we should just watch the next 30 seconds or so as she walks us through this incredibly cool, vibey headquarters of this mining company.
Play on.
We've made getting to work easy for
Nice.
you. You can
a
get
Tesla
in by
car.
car,
Yeah.
by bike. Thanks, Amrit. Or by bus.
She knows his name.
If you're driving,
very
you
sustainable.
can check your My
Those are
MinRes
not her
app
hands
to search
at
parking
all.
availability on each floor.
Oh,
This car
they
park
got an
has
app.
more
How convenient. And then like this poor woman, the executive
Shelley
general
Robertson.
manager energy, who's like pumping her gas or plugging her car in for her as if it's the
Just
fucking
hanging
like
in the car park?
1980s. Yeah, it's like quite depressing. I mean, what does this video say about the fucking absolute state of
What?
Australian
Yeah.
politics?
Where to start, man? Like, it's a wild ride. So 6 or 7 minutes, and as someone who has real attention issues, I was like super engaged by it. Really high production value. Julie's got this charisma, and the best part is that this mining video that's, to say, here's your life working at MinRes, this massive mining company, does not actually mention mining at all.
No,
like
not
when
once.
they're selling it, they're like, no, just
Absolutely
look over
not.
here. Look at our app.
Yeah, I feel like they're kind of hinting at it because they're like, we produce the minerals that are needed for this electric car, etc. But they don't actually talk about that. It's like the same. It's like the ads that you get to go and work at the army where they're not really talking about the core work of the army. They're just like, isn't this awesome and cool and epic and like a real vibe?
Yeah, we do something and it's like ... stage missing, like footage missing, and then, electric cars.
Literally. I mean, how else to describe this? I loved Isabella Corbett and Michael Delorio in Pedestrian that just called this the yassification of the mining industry. And it is possible.
It's crazy. So Joy Bishop is the chancellor of my old uni, ANU.
Oh.
And ANU actually, when I was there, they were going with this big fighting over divesting the university's investments in fossil fuels. And they made some like serious progress on that. And then to have like Julie Bishop, after her career kind of pinkwashing the coalition and everything that they did about fossil fuels in this country, to then get a job there and then do some spon con for a mining company. You just love to see it. You love to see a girl boss winning.
Yeah. Well, I mean, who could forget her iconic red shoes? Which, of course, like there are multiple references to in the video. They're like, those shoes, Julie. Yes.
Winning. Yeah. It's look, Joy Bishop is to me just kind of like the summation of how like we just have the weirdest political system where, she was someone who came up and really, made a name for herself defending against workers' asbestos claims. So these are people who'd worked for companies and been subjected to asbestos and had, all of the kind of maladies that came with it, many of them dying. And she, was part of this legal firm that played hardball, took ages on these proceedings. Some people said, alleged they didn't say this, but other people alleged it's kind of also playing the waiting game against people with limited lives. Then she goes into politics and then she's part of all that. And then she just comes out on the other side and now she's just kind of like, look at this like fun politician. No, don't worry about all the things that she's done. Totally accepted in polite society. Just ignore all that other stuff.
Yeah. It's, I mean, there's something incredibly dark about this video, but if we had a few more women just like Julie Bishop in politics and in business, a few more Julie Bishop CEOs, maybe the world would be a little bit of a better place. She's got that razzle-dazzle glint in her eye.
Talk about the Greens, that bunch of idiots.
If you want the dole for life, free marijuana, vote Greens.
It's the Greens. I mean, I can't answer for them. They've got all sorts of policies that I don't agree with. This is just one of them.
Frankly, I've always found the Greens to be a real serious danger to Australia.
Serious danger to Australia.
Okay, welcome everyone to Serious Danger. This is a podcast about green politics in Australia, but it's not an official Greens Party podcast, proven by the fact that this week we have a, I believe, non-Greens member as our co-host to replace Tom while he's away. Cam Wilson is an internet reporter with Crikey. Are you other things that you like to say?
I'm just kind of reporting on whatever takes my fancy at the time. And I'm really glad to be here because I'm going to drag this podcast to the sensible center. It's
Good,
time.
Finally. That's why we got you on.
It's going to go from serious danger to I guess, mild risk will be under my reign.
Exactly.
Yeah, none of this radical politics. Let's talk reasonably.
Thank you. Exactly. And we will be talking about, how the media do represent the sensible centre. On today's show, we'll also be talking about how Facebook and TikTok are constantly watching us. Should we care? What can we do about it? Etc. Before we get into it, I did want to say thank you to our new patrons, Matt, Jack, Sarah, David, and an account simply called Spirit of Anger and Hope, which I really love. Thank you so much for supporting the show. It allows us to pay our producer, Mike, so that we can keep doing the show. If you are a patron, you will have access, I think, as of a few days ago, we released a special premium episode on Friday where we play Rusted on Bingo with John Kudelka, the creator of the classic tea towel and bingo card. And we go through square by square and explain why all of these opinions are incredibly wrong and ours are the right opinions, and we kind of lose our minds a little. It's a really fun episode. Go listen to that now. And if you want to get access and you're not already subscribed, it's only like $3 a month. Chuck it our way and you can listen to hilarious content like this and help us keep doing the pod.
C3 on the Rusted on Bingo is a personal favourite of mine. So
Which
if
is
you want
C3?
to find out what it is, I think
you're keeping the mystery.
I was going to leave it as a mystery, but I'll give a little tease. I think that's the CPRS, personal favourite of mine, of course.
Well, and as John explains in the episode, like there's a reason that is kind of in the middle of the card. So it's quite intentional, the design of the card. So you can find out a little more on the premium episode.
So I was listening to a podcast about Australian politics, and they started a segment about TikTok.
I wanted to hear from you, Cam. You post a lot about stuff that's happening with TikTok in particular, but like tech platforms. And I feel like TikTok is still kind of flies under the radar in a lot of ways, or we don't necessarily, particularly, in the regulatory space, don't necessarily know how to approach what we still see as a new platform, despite it being like one of the biggest platforms or the biggest in Australia right now.
Not quite the biggest, but definitely getting up there, and certainly the new giant.
Yeah. There was a story, I think this week, was it that you were talking about, like basically the fact that China has access to all of your data if you use TikTok. What exactly does China have access to from my TikTok account? I don't even know. I don't want to know.
I mean, that's the point. We don't really know. So, I mean, TikTok is in many ways very similar to other apps that many people use, like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Google Maps, whatever, where it is predicated as a app of taking information off you and using that to, in some ways, sell things to you. And that usually means collecting information about you so it can figure out who you are so they can target ads to you in some way. What makes TikTok different, and I guess obviously different, and we'll come back to that, is that it is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. And although all these apps are collecting an insane amount of data on you, we call this, the idea of surveillance capitalism. They're surveilling you at all opportunities and using that to make some cash. The direct link between the Chinese government and TikTok is one that has attracted a lot of attention. People might remember that Donald Trump was all about it, and then he kind of negotiated a sale, which wasn't really a sale, but it was like Oracle, which is some big tech company that works mostly in businesses, was like, oh, we've got a contract with them to store their information in the US. And for a while, that seemed to make everyone happy. But the real issue is that, so in China, there's a law that requires any individual or organization to help with intelligence gathering if they ask. So essentially, if the Chinese government is like, hey, we want this, you got to kind of give it to them.
Okay.
Yeah, you're like, it's not like in Australia where it would be like, hey, we want to have a warrant for this, or a variety of ways which they can also get information off you. And
it's just a few more steps for them to go, okay, fine, I give up, you can have it.
Yeah, we're not perfect here, but that kind of that pathway gives people the idea that at any point TikTok could hand over information on a lot of people directly to the Chinese government. And I guess kind of where it gets complicated is that TikTok Australia has said that they have not given any information to the Chinese government so far. So it's all about this idea of the potential. And in the past, they've really kind of banked on this idea that we have servers that are in the US and Singapore, and that is where Australians' data is stored, which is kind of a bit of a misdirection, because where a server is, that's just a computer. It doesn't actually really matter if you can access it from wherever you are. And so at the end of the day, the crux of it is that there are Chinese staff who can access data, and the data that TikTok collects on you is, again, similar to other ones, but includes your location, your contact details, the videos you watch, your device's unique identification and other apps running on your device. It's collecting all that information all the time. There's this huge trove of data that they have on literally millions of Australians and tens or hundreds of millions of people around the world. And people are concerned that China has access to this at any time, and they could use that for, being like, Cameron, you spend a lot of time looking at pug videos on TikTok, and I'm going to use that to blackmail you or something. All hypothetical, but it's all about this idea that they have access to this.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, and I often wonder, I think that probably everyone spends a little bit of time hypothesizing exactly what a government could kind of learn about me from having this kind of data. I feel like TikTok particularly, just the algorithm is the first thing they do is try and decide whether you're gay or not. I don't know if that's other people's experience, but that is the number one thing that I've noticed. They're like, is this person queer? And if they think that there's a hint of an inkling that you're queer, they just they're like, okay, here's queer content. I know you fucking love this shit, don't you?
Yeah, you love
fucking sicko. I mean, I guess that could have ramifications for someone living under a government that is not so friendly to queer folks, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, look, there's a whole lot of data that does not seem necessarily that maybe important to you at any one point of time, that if you think creatively about it, can actually be pretty potentially damaging. So, I mean, an example of this is, in the US, obviously they're overturning Roe v. Wade and rolling back abortion rights. And how data can kind of end up being used in something like this is that, there's examples in the past of people being tried for murdering their unborn child based off Google searches about abortion drugs that were illegal to use at that time. There's hypothetical examples about, being able to use someone's location to be like, well, you spent time at this abortion clinic, and so we can use that to assist in investigation. So, I mean, look, you might be like right now, I'm a guy who does not spend, I spend so much time at home. I'm a real homebody. And so I'm like, well, who cares if China or anyone else has this information that I'm at home? But you need to think about creatively about, well, if for instance, they know the other apps on my phone, they can know, if I'm using Wickr, maybe I'm using Wickr to talk to sources. Maybe I'm using Wickr to buy drugs. Maybe they could use other contact details to find out things about me to essentially be able to, like, the uses of it are kind of endless, and it's really hard to consider. And I think the big thing about it, and I would like to talk about how, this is available to kind of all these apps, but while we're on TikTok at the moment, I think a big thing that just thinking about it is that there are so many users, a lot of them are underage, and we just don't know how this data could be used in the future. But it's kind of like, think of it like an oil spill. Like, once your data is out there, it's out there, and it's very, very hard to actually deal with. It has this like effect in the future that can be really damaging to you, and there's nothing you can really do after the fact to stop something like that. So if in the future in somewhere like Australia we had a government that cracked down on like LGBT rights, so now like maybe that seems very far-fetched, but in other countries in the world where was like that, they could use that evidence that you are using now when things are okay, when you're not thinking about this kind of regulation or surveillance. They could use that in the future to punish you, to even do things like, like change how much you're paying for insurance or something like that. Like it's companies as well who want to use this information. So I don't know, like it's hard. This is difficult to kind of deal with because you're like, well, how do I like think about what the potential ramifications are, 6 months from now, years from now, but it's really trying to be like, what is this potential risk that all this information out there is going to have? And even though they may not have even invented these kind of purposes yet.
Yeah. It's not so far-fetched to think that the Australian government might use that data to crack down on activists, for example, or to compel, or to get journalist sources. So there are definitely areas that I think like that data could be used, but it's a weird one. I find that I personally find it difficult to kind of engage in the digital rights space politically, and I feel like the Greens have lost a little bit of that since, we lost Scott Ludlam. I think he really led a lot of this. And it's almost because it's like one of those areas where the line between tinfoil hat kind of like conspiracy theorizing and reality is a little more blurred because it is all speculative. Like there's this kind of vague sense that like, well, we don't know what the problems could be in the future with this, but it feels like it could probably fucking be bad. So it just feels like it's a really hard one. And because it is just simply so inescapable, like in the society in which we live,
we live in a society.
We do.
I can report that.
We live in a very digital society, and our access to everything, work, the economy, other people, social networks, etc. It's all mediated through these digital platforms that are taking our data. And so I think everyone kind of reaches a point of just helplessness where we're like, well, I can't fucking live without this. So what am I going to do? Just like stay home and not be able to live, work, play, anything?
Totally.
I give up. Take my data.
Yeah, so I mean, like there's already just thinking about it, there's examples that, in the future, you can imagine this data could be used for. Like an example would be, if you're an environmental activist, what if you've been watching, a bunch of Blockade Australia TikToks and they could use that to be like, you had prior intent to go and do something. And so that is used as part of like a prosecution against you. Maybe you're someone who is on like Job Seeker and is accessing welfare, and you have been, they use the location that you gave up through TikTok to be like, you've actually moved more than you said you have, and yet you say you can't go get a job in this place, or you've been again accessing content about like getting out of having to do some of the mutual obligations. Like, this stuff is not actually that far-fetched. As for like what we can do about it, I've talked about TikTok a lot, but really these are all of these applications. And so that's why this idea of individualizing, a very like neoliberal thing to be like, well, why don't you just simply opt out of this and choose to live your life differently? It's not really possible. Like, it's just not like possible, I think, realistically, to live in modern society and not use any of the big tech platforms and any of the things that are gathering data on you. And so as a result, I think this idea that we could somehow be like, stop using TikTok or stop using Facebook doesn't actually solve it for people. And so we need to think of a different kind of collective solution to that. Unfortunately, it's very, very complicated because, when I was talking about like, for instance, TikTok and this like direct line between TikTok and China, it gets even more complicated because, this surveillance capitalism system that we live in, like all these ad networks are incredibly sophisticated, and a lot of them are actually sending data, even somewhere like Facebook or other companies like Google are sending information that might end up going through China anyway. So this idea that it's just TikTok that's a national security risk, again, is an overly simplistic thing. And so you're just kind of like, what do we do? Like, regulators really struggle to deal with something like this because it's so complicated. Companies in themselves don't always understand where all this information is going and these systems that they're involved in. And like, I mean, the answer is we have to do something about it. But simply even trying to like deconstruct this system, it's nearly impossible.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's the same resistance from the major parties that there is anytime we ask them to regulate, the free market in any way. They don't want to impede on these companies' ability to make a fucking massive profit from commodifying everything that we do. But yeah, they probably bloody should.
Think about the red tape of having to figure out if we're sending like 14-year-olds locations to China. Think about how that red tape would stop innovation.
Yeah, that's true. And these tech companies are really doing it tough,
Oh, I feel bad for them. Real bad for them. So I mean, I don't really know what like you can kind of do about it. There is at the moment a review of the Privacy Act, which I think is really like the first step. It's a really old piece of legislation, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in it. Like, technology's moved so much in the time since it was last updated, some point last decade, and it's a bit. I'm a bit skeptical because there's so much to deal with, and pinning your hopes on this one single like review, which has been going on for a really long time and has essentially been punted down the road by the last government and is now in the hands of this one. But that's where it's got to start. The answers are very complicated. I don't really have them, but this should be a priority for us because it is a problem that we, like I said before, has consequences a long way in the future for what is happening now. And I do think that, this, like you said before, what can we do? Like, it's easy to be apathetic about it.
Yeah.
I think, we should always be, conscious of our own actions. And so, it's kind of like being like, well, my diet isn't great, so what does it matter if I smoke as well? Like, there is some individual, I don't think we should just say it's individual responsibility, but I do think you should be like, maybe I choose not to upload pictures of my young niece online because I know that information is out there and can then be scraped by people and put into like biometric databases. Like, thinking about how you and other people around you are consenting to put information out there is probably the most important thing I would suggest at the start, and something that you can start individually doing that doesn't necessarily involve having to like live off the grid.
Yeah. Because I mean, there's also the question, like there's the issues around how your data is gathered and sold and used, but related to that is how that is then used to push kind of things back to you. And obviously over the last decade or so, there has been a little bit of discussion about this, about how
Cambridge
platforms,
Analytica.
Exactly. Yes. So, Facebook using data to effectively influence the outcome of an election and like deliver these very tailored kind of political messages. And there is speculation, about TikTok, but also, I mean, it's quite obvious on YouTube about how the algorithm will push far-right content and often suppress more left-wing content. And this is all, I do wonder if we need to have another kind of Cambridge Analytica moment. I don't know if that really it did. I don't know if it did anything to fix Facebook in a way, but it did sort of feel like it at least made them it made it a little harder for them to keep doing that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Cambridge Analytica, we don't need to get into the discussion of it. It was actually, I think, slightly missold. But like generally what it did, at least to public opinion, was really make them more conscious about how all this stuff was working. I think the one thing I would just like to mention, I think this is undercovered in the media and in discussions of technology generally, which is that we talk about the eggheads in Silicon Valley, all the bros coming up with their new apps or whatever. And we always ascribe to them this sense that they're kind of amoral. So, they don't really care, the Mark Zuckerberg social network movie kind of thing. But at the same time, we also give them this almost like benefit of the doubt that they're very smart. We say they're smart, but they don't have very good ethics. I want people to start questioning whether they're actually that smart because, because tech all the time, you hear about the ways that tech does not work well. Like with facial recognition, for example, it has traditionally been trained, like a lot of the data sets have been trained on white faces. And so facial recognition technology is very bad at actually recognizing brown on people or person of color like faces. And so when it's used by people, for instance, to try and track crimes, it often mischaracterizes someone as someone else. Like it's like, that's that person when it actually isn't. Yeah. And we do this kind of like issue with technology that it's often not as good as what it says. And the real impact is not when it works well, but when it works badly is something that we really need to consider. Like we shouldn't look at a technology working as it's intended and being like, well, let's think of the worst case scenario from that. We should look at it and being like, what if it doesn't work? How is that going to hurt people it's involved with? Because very often it doesn't. These like tech companies are often rolled out, they talk about bootstrapping and kind of, starting it up out of nothing. They very often are not putting in many safeguards, not thinking about how it could be misused or when it doesn't work well. We should essentially assume the worst because when we do so, we stop marginalized people from being hurt, particularly those people who aren't typically involved in tech, people of color, women, trans people who aren't involved in thinking up these products, who then have products used on them. They're the ones who often get hurt by it, who aren't considered in the process, who we need to start putting, front and center.
Yeah. And probably like particularly the tech industry is liable to this kind of thing because it is all about like being the first and, getting something out incredibly, like as quickly as possible. And this quite like chaotic energy. I mean, that's the brand of Silicon Valley. And so, it's not a surprise that they often fuck things up. And maybe we should not only be worried about like the evil genius mastermind tech bro kind of trope as we should be as about simple fucking rushing and incompetence.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so funny. Like this is kind of also like broadening it out. You know how all the time there's this trope, this stereotype that the public sector is so wasteful and you see things done in the private sector. And a great example is you often see, this comes out in the media all the time, this website costs, hundreds of thousands of dollars to design. And they're like, but I could launch a blog on WordPress for nothing and I could do it myself. Well, one, as someone who's worked in both private sector and public sector, let me tell you that like the excess in private sector is insane. Yeah. But also the reason that things often in the public sector cost more is because they actually have more requirements. They have to go through more like safeguards.
Red tape, Cam.
Exactly, red tape. But like the red tape is stuff like, with websites, using that example, it is often like so that it can be used by people who aren't just abled people, who aren't people who can see everything and use computers like without any restrictions. So it costs more and it takes longer to do these things because their products need to be used by more people. And it's that tech kind of ideology that you can just roll something out and you can figure out the rest later. Doesn't really like that's such a private sector ideology, obviously, but not enough. It just gets said that like not only is it stuffing up all the time, but it really does sometimes exclude people who need to be able to use these things.
You're just jealous. You're just jealous because you can't create an app that's really cool.
Exactly. I'm in the private sector at the moment and I'm extremely efficient. So maybe I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure you're speaking for the majority of journalists who are trained, have it driven into their heads that this is a crusading, a profession, adversarial, we stand up against power, a very self-serving view.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that journalists are?
I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
But now it's time for me to put you onto the microscope and tear you to fucking shreds.
Get the dogs.
Because, you are a person of journalist.
POJ.
You're a POJ. And I think it's about time we talk about why the media is so fucking bad in Australia and especially bad at doing politics reporting. Do you agree? Are they all bad? Are journalists cringe?
Journalists are cringe. Do you know, I have this theory that journalists are like they're all deeply frustrated because journalists want to be powerful, I think, in a way. Like they want to break stories and influence the world. But they also don't want to too scrutinized. Like they don't want to be the person who is the camera is like focusing on. Maybe they want to be in front of the camera for the attention, but like they don't want to be the subject of scrutiny. And so they're always conflicted between this like, I matter, I'm important, but at the same time being like, but please don't like look at me.
That's so fucking true. That is so typical of like so many journalists that I know, that they're very conflicted.
They're volcells. People gonna know what that is.
Yeah. As in like voluntary incel?
Voluntary celibates.
Voluntary yes. Sorry, not involuntary. I mean, maybe every profession is like sold the lie somewhat at uni that your profession is like going to make you incredibly important. You're going to change the world. Like it's so honorable. I do wonder though if maybe journalism is one of the most oversold. Like if you're a doctor, you literally are saving lives, for example. But I did journalism courses at uni because I did a comms degree.
Wow.
And it really was, I'm outing myself. Well, we all know anyone who works in comms is just a failed journalist. So like that's why I hate journalists. It's because I'm not one. But oh my God, like you leave uni just being like, these people are heroes. It's the fourth estate, the watchdog.
Braver than the troops.
Yeah, persecuted champion of the people. and to not live up to that is like presumably quite frustrating.
Yeah. We live in dissatisfaction. Yeah, I didn't do journalism at uni, but I kind of did the student paper stuff. But I do think that, journalism used to have a more, I guess you'd say like grounded roots as a craft. Like like journalism at its core is a very simple thing, right? You go and chat to people and you find out things that haven't been said and you elevate other people's voices and you give information to people so that they can live good lives. Like, I know that sounds funny, but you're like, what information do you need to navigate a civic society? Who are you going to vote for? How you want to choose to live your life? All those kinds of things. But I do think that, there is an elevated sense of kind of self-worth. But I think that here's how I'd say, like journalists and journalism, I think is important. Journalists individually, each journalist, it shouldn't be and really isn't. And like, that's okay. I can live with that. I'm fine.
You sound upset.
No, I'm fine. I'm okay. The therapy's helped. No, it's like I think it's just like, of course, like I have an ego like anyone else, but the thing that I try to do to keep me grounded, and I think when you see people lose that grounding, is that you're just there to tell someone else's story and help other people, and really like you shouldn't be really part of it. And ideally, like, hopefully you're good at your job, but also like you should be able to be replaced by someone else because you're not the point of all your coverage.
Well, I think that's interesting though, because like there is simultaneously, I would say, this idea that media is becoming more partisan like that it's not as unbiased as it used to be, which I think is not the fact. Like if you look at early journalism, like tabloids have always taken a pretty clear kind of perspective, and maybe there was some sort of golden age of journalism where it was more focused on just scrutiny, but everything that is written is coming from a certain perspective. But at the same time that, there is an increased demand for that kind of journalism that unashamedly comes from a particular perspective and new kinds of content being created. Like, I don't know would you say that journalism is kind of in a period of like flux and potentially crisis? Is it dying or is it just changing?
Emerald, you should know, as someone involved in politics, that if you ask someone a whole bunch of questions, they just get to answer the easiest one and ignore the rest of them.
Pick one. That's right. What I will say is,
I'm gonna. Do you remember when Scott Morrison was Prime Minister and the Australian cricket team were choosing to kneel in kind of like a Black Lives Matter tribute, and then you had all the people being like, can we just bloody leave the politics out of sport? That's kind of what journalism has gone through, which is that there's been this response to it now that it's like, it's getting increasingly political. But the truth is that everything is political, and journalism particularly, why we're now getting more awareness of that is because we're giving scrutiny to it in a way that we haven't before, and we're looking at the biases that it's always had. And also we're elevating new voices who are able to say that like a lot of the way that journalism has worked in the past has been biased. You just haven't noticed because it's all been the same people in there who see the world in the same way. So yes, we're seeing more like scrutiny of it, which is a great thing because, you know, like many other things, journalism has traditionally been, you know, a white male dominated industry from people from well-off backgrounds and certainly like very similar backgrounds who have decided the way that history is written, or at least the first draft of it. Now we're seeing that change, and we're seeing, you know, a lot of independent media come through, and that's allowed a good critique of it. So I do think that we're in a moment of change at the moment. I think it's just we're casting more critical eyes on it that haven't always had an opportunity to critique journalism in a way that has been heard and been able to present an alternative, which is a great thing. We've obviously got the issues as well of like everything that the digital companies have done to journalism's traditional business model, which is also a thing.
Well, that's what I mean. Like sometimes I think a big question, and I don't really know, is how much of what is wrong with journalism, and maybe I should articulate what I mean by
lay
that.
it on me.
To start. Like I think that there's just generally an inability of Australian media to actually understand what is going on in politics, and particularly I find this with the Greens. And there's kind of an over-reliance on easy sources and the same voices who are very available, whether it's from a political party or quite often an NGO, think tanks, current and you know, former politicians. And to kind of just take what they're given and present that as fact. You know, I guess there's that old trope about not just looking out the window to see whether it's raining and simply just reporting that one person says it's raining and one person says it's not. But yeah, I do wonder, is that because there is this institutional interest in maintaining the status quo and kind of suppressing any kind of movement that could disrupt that? Or is it just that journalists don't have time because they're incredibly under-resourced and overworked, don't have time to really go out and figure out what is going on?
I think it is a bit of both. I see the two main problems that journalism have are, the first one is that a lot of issues stem from just how journalism is made. And, you know, Crikey has a new young reporter who we brought in the last few weeks and trying to help her understand about how the sausage is actually made. Just made me remember again that it's like, in many ways, it's kind of weird and strange. And so to kind of explain that, like, when I write a news article, I need something that is new generally. I need something that is different that people haven't said, but I also need something. Like, I can't just go out there and be like, the vibes are off. Like I have to be able to, and trust me, they are, but like, I have to have something that I need to point off. To. Yeah, maybe that is actually a strong lead. Yeah. I have to have something that I point to. And often they're quite manufactured. And this is where you get into this kind of political journalism part of it, where you need someone important to say something, or you need something, an event to happen. You need something to then generally be able to explain something that is bigger than that. So you're like, the Greens have said, like Adam Bandt said this, and you then use that to then talk about what this means for the debate that's happening over the carbon emissions target at the moment. Yeah. But at its core, you need like that thing to happen. And that's often what then dictates the media coverage, because some people are better at giving the media what they want and understanding, well, you know, for instance, for me at Crikey, we're still mostly, our workflow mostly like revolves around our daily newsletter. And so for me, I'm like, I need something by this time. And whatever I kind of need, that's what I get on and construct around that. And if someone makes it easy for me to like give me something in the time that I need, that's more likely that they're going to have something written, because I'm purely just having to, like anyone else, I've got a, you know, deadline and I've got to get this done by this point. So the people who like a lot of political media is quite small. There's a few people who are in the press gallery who work with similar kind of sources, and those sources know the ins and outs of how media works. And so they're able to manipulate that to the full extent. And so it is really a kind of collaboration between the journalist and often political sources.
Yeah.
And so, both are involved in this as well. And so obviously, you get these kind of incentives aligned where politicians know that they have something good and juicy that they can give it to an outlet, and that outlet, that kind of strengthens their relationship with them. They get something published there. Maybe their side of the story gets told more because they are the ones who are working with them. All of these aspects of like the actual creation, how the sausage is made affects it. The second part is just really quickly and very simply, like journalism has traditionally not been fully representative of Australia. I touched on this before, but like the people who go into media are very similar very often. I mean, hey, I'm like really, really similar amongst them. I'm a 31-year-old male who lives in Sydney, who went to a private boys' school. I couldn't be almost anything more like close to the average of them. Boo. But not. Hey, I'm a cool journalist. I'm not like those other journalists. Like sit in my chair backwards. You are very
much the journalist archetype and the podcaster archetype. Some might say.
Yeah, I'm a podcaster and poster at heart. But I mean, look, we all know that it's more than just the diversity of, your literal demographics. Journalists can and should be doing more to, raise the voices of other people who you aren't yourself, and that's what I strive to do. But just generally, the kind of homogeneity of Australian media has restricted the kind of views that they get there, because just the judgments that they make all the time. Like every time they're like, someone gives me a comment, and to me, I'm like, that's a good point. Or I'm like, that's not a good point. And if it's a good point, I'll include it. If it's not a good point, I might say this isn't useful for my audience. Being able to change that, being able to get more people in there means that you'll get a change in what viewpoints are necessarily recognized. And being able to get more people in there means hopefully you get something that represents the audience better.
Yeah, I think I think that's true, but I also think that we should be wary of assigning too much importance to the identity makeup of journalists in the industry, because I do think a lot of the time it comes down to the top levels. Like it's not just journalists. Like I work with journalists obviously in my job, and the age yeah, that's right. The age-old fucking story is that you talk to a journalist, they are very interested, they look into the story, sometimes they even write the story, and for some reason it never comes out. And there are certain issues, particularly I noticed this with housing, and, for a long time it would often be something about, the trajectory of the coal industry, for example, in Queensland. There are certain things that just don't get coverage in mainstream media. And I don't think it's a coincidence that these are outlets like 9 Fairfax is particularly bad. Their investors include, the real estate industry, and the mining and resources industry. And I do think the fact that media as like a privatized institution and a very concentrated media landscape we have in Australia, they are so tied in with those like particular industries and with capital, that it would make it incredibly difficult for a left movement relying on mainstream media to get anywhere with that, because it's not in their interest.
So I think that it's true. It's that there is a lot of factors about the system that we live in that influences media. As someone who's worked for, I've worked for 9 in the past, I know that, I've never had Peter Costello tap me on the shoulder and be like, not sure about that. They're not sure about that line. Or I've never had personally, a call from an investor or something. And I doubt that happens like a whole lot. But, the system that they're in, kind of like without having to specify it, does create the incentives for certain kind of content that agrees with, sponsors, and, maybe makes it harder for content that doesn't necessarily agree with, with sponsors. I mean, like advertisers or other people. So sometimes I do see a caricature of like, all these advertisers have a direct line to the journalists, which isn't true. And I think most editors do a very good job of trying to keep that stuff away from their actual journalists. But you also do see like, these, like you said, these decisions are made by top level people, and the top level people decide who is put into leadership positions, and that's obviously people who fit within these systems. So it's nuanced, it's complicated, it definitely affects it all. I probably wouldn't, if you see an article that you disagree with from like Nine, I wouldn't be like, they're like a liberal shill, but it's more like trying to understand the system that they're in, that ultimately it kind of makes it easier for some kinds of reporting and harder for other kinds of reporting.
Yeah. And I do think, like, even not necessarily saying that the investors are like calling up and being like, kill the story. But
Kill it.
But I think just like generally there is an understanding of, that there are certain things that we can't quite touch. We don't really want to paint a picture, for example, that it would be a good thing if house prices go down, or that the problem, with the housing crisis is not that there, isn't enough social housing and the private market's totally fucked it up, but it's that it's too hard to build new developments, like things like that. And that can even just be those people in those editorial positions are often part of a class that is property owning, probably.
Which is it, I really think. Still the top editors at most of the publications in the country are going to be middle-aged to older white men for the most part. And also they're well off because they're in a leadership position. They're paid well. They live in nice places. They have nice houses. You even see this all the way down to like, I think there's like a bias in the media towards not working from home because these editors are like, they and also like I think even like part of the bias towards like lockdowns also comes from people who live in like nice houses, writing about how it's not that bad working from home as well. Not to say it's not medically right, but just understanding this, like for me it's less like conscious and more how the people who make big decisions have like run in certain circles, live certain lives, and how that affects all of the media that kind of flows out from there. I think there is a happy-ish ending to this, which is that the very problem that is challenging traditional media, mainstream media, which is the rise of independent media and creators who exist outside of traditional structures and can use social media and sorry, I'm talking about me, Cam Wilson. No, I'm talking about like, the Serious Danger podcast. I'm talking about any individual journalist or tweeter or Twitch streamer or whoever can now present an alternative that can actually get to many people. And that's a challenge because, that's obviously doesn't have the same kind of gatekeepers that traditional media has that kept some of the craziest bits out of it. I obviously write a lot about conspiracy theories and that kind of thing. That's all over the place now. But it also means that we're seeing, certain perspectives that haven't traditionally been represented have an opportunity and find an audience, and ultimately becomes like it feels more democratic because if you are someone now who maybe presents something that wouldn't get always a really good run in traditional media, if there's people out there who want it, like you can get it to them now. Obviously understanding that they're still mediated through these platforms which have their problems of their own, which we've talked about. But this allows now not only for independent media to kind of come out and give a voice and amplify perspectives that don't always, but it also affects traditional media as well. When you see people outside of these big organizations and they're finding huge audiences because they're doing a perspective that matters, the media's like, oh, maybe we should cover that as well. Yeah. There's interest in that. It's all part of the same, like, everyone's watching each other and wants to see where their audience is. Everyone ultimately wants to serve big audiences and reflect their audience. I really do believe that, very small parts of the country in terms of actual number of people are really like hardly like in the media and editorializing their kind of political perspective. And we can talk about News Corp maybe a bit later. But they most of them want to do a good job and reach as many people as they can. And now we're seeing a way that audiences can actually indicate their support in a way that wasn't really possible before.
Yeah, well, let's talk about News Corp actually, because I mean, I think that the first thing that a lot of people, particularly a lot of people who would identify as being on the left of Australian politics, if you say, Australian media is cooked, they think that you are simply talking about the dominance of Murdoch. And I mean, you called your podcast, you had a podcast called Murdocracy, which talked about this, right?
That's right. I did, yeah. So I had a podcast, RIP, I ditched before the election because things were getting too crazy. that was covering closely how News Corp influenced and operated in Australia. And my thought process was this, which is that News Corp is made out to be a big baddie, and it is bad in a lot of ways. But I do think that any pushes to change it has to be accurate and understand it for what it is. And I thought that both the proponents of News Corp and also sometimes the detractors of News Corp didn't quite always get it right. And the best way to influence something would be to really accurately understand what it was doing and how it was affecting Australia so that we could be like, well, here's the problem and here's actually how we fix it. And what I discovered, I think, was that one, it's enormously influential. And its influence comes from the fact that it has powers that it is willing to use, unlike other publications. And by that, I mean like the editors in News Corp, as is now well reported, are not on a direct line to Rupert Murdoch, but kind of like I was talking about before, but more intense. They know the things that he likes. They see the people who get promoted. And so they're able to shape their publication's coverage and the framing in a way that they think suits the powers that be. And so how they end up having a huge influence in Australia is not necessarily by like making up stuff. You know, a lot of their stuff is accurate, if not sometimes framed in a way that is salacious or misleading, but is very, 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 very rarely like factually, like completely factually incorrect. But it is always framing it in a way that kind of and focusing on things that presents the world in a certain way. And I kind of think of it almost as like the Eye of Sauron, where it's like I focus on things and by focusing on things, not only do I get you to pay attention to it, but I also get other parts of Australian media to pay attention to it too. Like, you know, if I just have people who all they do is report on how much Dan Andrews suck, like, you know, in a completely negative way, and they cover a story about how he legitimately sucks, but then other media is going to cover it as well. That's how they have influence, that they're able to find stuff by focusing on things, on people they don't like and people they do like in a positive way to tell the stories they want to tell.
Yeah. I mean, I think I have lots of thoughts about News Corp because I almost think about it as, if you think of the different kind of media factions as almost like political parties or as political movements in Australia, which they kind of operate as in some ways. And it's like the different ones have different kind of theories of change, but they are generally like, and different strategies, but they're often working towards the same goal, which I think is to maintain the kind of the status quo and to maintain, you know, existing economic systems, et cetera. And like, while I think that News Corp has a very, they do tend to actually run campaigns. Like they can be quite explicit about, now we're running a campaign on this issue. It's really thought out.
Net Zero by 2050 was the big one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They'll do, you know, and they'll often even say, we're launching this series of coverage. And they will just be fucking relentless about it and like very obvious. Whereas I think that other outlets like 9 Fairfax or ABC will just have a more kind of like, they absolutely cling to the idea that they are nonpartisan, that they're non-biased, that they're just presenting like an objective view, but are still so incredibly tied to the political class. And sometimes I would rather read the Courier Mail because it is directed towards an audience that is not so much part of the political class and establishment as those outlets like The Guardian or ABC, et cetera, are. And like, honestly, I'm kind of more interested in that somewhat anti-establishment view, even though obviously News Corp is deeply tied in with the establishment. It's just kind of more interesting. But yeah, I think that the whole hashtag News Corp thing on Twitter and people who are like militantly anti-Murdoch.
News Corps.
Exactly. Yeah. News Corps. Yeah. It's like they're missing the point because it's all kind of part of the same machine. It's just different flavors to my mind.
Yeah. I think you're definitely right about how they have different ideas about how they use it. And I hate to be the News Corp defender, but I do want to like point out that like, you know, there has been a lot of good journalism that's done by News Corp, particularly in the regional papers. You know, not everyone is, when they exist. Like not everyone is Peter Credlin. And I think sometimes, you know, you see people attacking journalists just because they write for News Corp.
Yes.
I mean, I choose not to work for them because I think ultimately they have a negative impact on the world. I just don't. I don't think it's ethical personally. Of
course.
But I also like I'm not going to. I didn't spend my time sleeping over someone who works for the like Narrogin Observer, writing about their local council that's owned by News Corp. I think just the biggest thing is being clear-eyed about the way that they are willing to use this power. And, you know, it's not always for like necessarily bad reasons. News Corp was ran a campaign that was no jab, no play. Like they were the people who really pushed for trying to get children's vaccination rates up in the last decade. So like, you know, sometimes it's for good as well. But the truth is the majority of the time is that they are able to use their powers to attack ideologies that they think are not, that they don't agree with. And very often, and that obviously is a very conservative point of view. They make it easy for the people who they support and they make it hard for the people that they oppose. And they can do that incredibly influentially. And that's why it deserves criticism, because we should, you know, when people do a good job at News Corp and cover things well, we should be like, great, I want you to know that's good and I want to support that. But when they don't, we should be honest and not be, you know, distracted by the other stuff and be like, this sucks, I'm not supporting this. Use our might as consumers, don't click, don't buy or whatever, because at the end of the day, they are a business and they will respond to, in some ways, audience desires. And if we show that what they do is not necessarily commercially palatable, man, that like change their mind. Like the net zero by 2050 thing was them realizing that like the majority of people in every electorate supported climate action. And so they realized like that they couldn't just be, you know, on their pulpit saying no climate action because people would stop reading them. So they conceded something that was totally tokenistic and inadequate in every way, but it gave them a chance to be like, we're leading, we're telling, we're doing this thing while also still not going too far. And that kind of like, you know, that was clever by them because like it ultimately, I think has, you know, probably it blocked significant and necessary climate action, but at the same time they couldn't just completely deny it forever, and that's what we need to understand is their weakness. They have to at some extent respond to their audience. Well,
I think, but in some ways that is a weakness, but also a strength, or like kind of endears me to them because they do respond to an audience of more, you know, ordinary people than a lot of these other outlets, which is why you will see them. I don't know. I'm not sure if I agree because I think that I know their readership's pretty skewed.
Yeah, and I do know that they use these quite like often affected styles as if they're like, you know, trying to be like, we're salt of the earth, blue collar stuff.
Yeah,
but like,
no, of course.
But like, trust me, the full political warriors, you know, like the Daily Telegraph's political editor, the people who are on Sky News After Dark, the ones who are really the editors who are really, you know, actually acting as political operatives. One, they are all incredibly not representative of Australia, and it like just the way that they pretend to be is that often I think like quite demeaning to just average Australians as well. And look, you know, News Corp circulation for their newspapers, like outside of like news.com.au, is actually quite small. But because they use their power, because they have like, you know, all these like commercial agreements and that kind of stuff, they are still a giant. Even though when you hear people talking about the Murdoch monopoly, they're not even the biggest media company in Australia. Like Nine is actually bigger than them. The difference is that News Corp uses their power.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. Like, and I don't want to, say that I believe that the Courier Mail readership, for example, is like representative of, you know, the vast majority of Queenslanders, because obviously it's not. But it does, I do think that like outlets, particularly like the ABC and the Guardian, are not responding in any meaningful way to what like matters to ordinary people. They're just responding to whatever the political and media class, you know, is talking about. And that's why we get, like, if you look at the Guardian coverage, I think I was talking to you about, you know, the Guardian's coverage of the upcoming climate bill is just such a perfect example of what is so frustrating about Australian political, you know, coverage. They'll publish like an article that is just fully kind of recounting the Greens position, which like for me as a PR person for the Greens, I'm like, fantastic, love this article.
Yeah.
and then yeah, like
What
this
the
is
hell?
like
I love the Guardian now.
yeah. And then next, like in the next couple of days, I'll have this article that's like former environmental activist grassroots person says that the Greens are going to ruin everything. And it's just this like Labor internal group person who ran for Labor pre-selection and didn't get it, talking about how the Greens are shit, and like
they're just reporting the facts.
I mean that's the kind of thing that just really pisses me off, because it is just so fucking out of touch with fucking everyday people's lives, like, and so easy to just fall into that vortex, and we end up in places like this podcast.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes from that press gallery reporting. And like, I've just defended News Corp, so why don't I defend The Guardian as well?
Of course. Typical fucking journalist.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I'm just like, it's
own.
class solidarity.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, The Guardian has journalists who report on regional stuff, and when they're actually talking to people in regional areas, that's the stuff that I think obviously matters to people.
Guardian does good inequality report. Like their inequality reporting has been fantastic.
Reporting is the best in Australia.
Some of the Queensland reporting around, the Greens result in the recent federal election, I think was really good, because they actually took the time to go out and figure out what was happening on the ground. Mm-hmm. So yes, I will agree.
It is a lot of the broken nature of press gallery reporting, which is that, like I was just saying before, how the sausage is made. There's only a few people who they talk to. They have to keep good relationships, and very often just what they like. The way that their whole world revolves around is powerful people. They talk only to powerful people and hear what they say, hear them sparring against each other. They don't spend that long talking to the people that these policies actually affect. And that is the real, like, when I think about why I do journalism and what I strive to do, it's like, how do you give people who don't already have a Facebook page with hundreds of thousands of followers who can already reach audiences, how do I give the other people a chance to have their voice heard, even if they aren't an elected representative, even if they aren't a party operative? That's the thing that I think is important, and ultimately what is actually will always help journalism stay relevant, which is that that feeling that when people read something and they say, I understand that, or I've seen that same thing, I know that sentiment, or I felt that way. That's the kind of stuff that will keep us relevant, and that's the thing I think we need to keep on doing.
So true, King.
So true, bestie.
If you hop onto my Facebook on the 17th of July, where I made a comment, put up a post about electric vehicles with Ministers Mark Bailey and Debretti, and just go through and look at some of the comments that are in that post. I think what that will do, and I certainly don't want to demonise people who are making those comments, but if you go through and have a look, you will get a sense of how the issue of climate change and how we transition to that space is just so complex, with so many disparate views here in Queensland.
Well, thank you very much, Cam, for filling in as, white man while Tom is away. We really need it to make the podcast actually legally able to stream on most platforms. So, sure you understand. Our call to action this week, you suggested Digital Rights Watch, and it's got the seal of approval because it's approved by our hot angel, Scott Ludlam. You can donate to Digital Rights Watch to support their research, advocacy and campaigns on privacy and digital rights. We'll put the link in the show notes. Do you have anything else that you want to plug, Cam?
Oh, follow me on Twitter. That's where I kind of promote all my other stuff. I'm across too many platforms. It's so funny. I talk all the time about be careful about what you're on, and then I'm on literally everything. I Twitch stream. I do TikTok. I post articles. I don't know. If you're not already sick of me from this podcast, you can get a whole lot of me elsewhere.
Cool. Yeah. And what's your Twitter handle?
At Cameron Wilson.
At Cameron Wilson. It's pretty simple.
Very original. Yeah.
Babe. Go follow Cam. Your Twitch streams are quite good. I recommend them. And if you like the show Serious Danger, to which you are currently listening, please tell the world, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening.
Rate and review.
Rate and review. 5 stars or fuck off. You can also
why don't you give us a review? Write a message to me specifically in your review.
Yes. Tell us what you think about Cam. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us why Tom shouldn't come back.
Well, yeah. Or
Tom should stay on holiday.
exactly. Or why Cam made you really miss Tom.
Uh-huh. Or why Cam convinced you that News Corp isn't that bad.
Yes, yeah, sure. Any of that. Like, tell us your thoughts, please, in the review section. You also can support the show on Patreon. As I said, you'll get access to the latest premium episode about Rust on Bingo, but you also get access to 2 other premium episodes about our book review, and then there was the other one about the 4 pillars of the Greens and internal factions and juicy stuff. And we're going to be doing more Patreon content as time goes on because we are running out of money to pay Mike and we need to get something going so we can keep the show running.
Support
so please,
Mike.
please support Mike. He does so much for us. He deserves to get paid. Subscribe on Patreon. You can also follow us on @SeriousDangerAU on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. For all the info, just head to seriousdangerpod.com. Thank you so much again, Cam. Enjoy your little journalism. I guess you have a story to publish or something, don't you?
I do. Enjoy your wrangling of journalists on the other side.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Serious danger to Australia.